Hi, I'm Bob Gymlan. In 2011, this skull and torso was unearthed in a shallow grave in Peru, near Cusco. Nearby artifacts indicate that the skull was deposited during the Inca Empire, and this skull represents one of the greatest anthropological mysteries of all time. And I'll get into the contextual circumstance behind it in a moment, but first, it may be beneficial to scrutinize the remains with no context, from a strictly clinical perspective. It can easily be determined that this skull belongs to an infant. The specimen has an obvious fontanelle, or the gap in the skull that allows the brain to grow, because the brain grows faster than bone. It is indicative of a specimen that was no older than 2 years of age, but probably closer to 1 year old. For the sake of clarity, normal human infants have relatively large, unshapely skulls. But this is different. This is highly abnormal. This head is giant. The cranium appears to be about as large, if not larger than, the chest cavity, which is abnormal by any standard. The nasal septum seems quite small. The nose should protrude at least a little bit, but this one doesn't seem to. The orbital or eye sockets are uncharacteristically large, and again, an extremely large cranium. Now myself and most doctors would initially speculate hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid is blocked by the spine and builds up in the brain, therefore forcing the cranium to stretch and thin. Here's an image of a normal infant brain, and a brain filled with fluid consistent with hydrocephalus. If the brain is not drained, the patient will die, generally before the age of 2. And again, the pressure of the fluid stretches and brittles the bone, making it much thinner than average. But according to radiologist Eric Flores, this Inca specimen's skull is of proper width and density, and not at all consistent with hydrocephalus. In cases of hydrocephalus, the brain leaves an imprint on the inside of the cranial wall as a result of the constant pressure, which this skull doesn't have. This skull is of normal, even healthy width and density, and the skull is bare of any trauma caused by enlarged brain matter. In short, this skull belonged to a healthy little baby. But of course, context is important. The specimen was found on Viracochan, or Mountain of the Creator. Many remains have been found here. Many remains of children that were sacrificed to the Inca gods. By the year 1450, the Inca Empire had become the largest empire in the Americas, and one of the largest unified civilizations of its time. Over 12 million subjects were loyal to their emperor, their Sempa Inca, their son of the sun. The Incan Empire held ground in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, with the capital in Cusco, Peru. In 1526, Spanish conquistadors made contact with the Inca. Employing relentless deception, overwhelming technology, and smallpox, the last Incan emperor was sieged out of his final stronghold, captured, and executed. This took less than 40 years. The Inca had no currency. Goods and services were valued at the amount of time a task was taken to complete. Money, labor, and time. It really all balances in the end. The Inca were relatively peaceful. Most of their empire was built off peaceful assimilation, because the benefits to being part of the empire were immense. However, the ultimate taxation, known as a blood tax, was children, to be sacrificed to the gods. Usually to ask for a smooth transition between leadership. No doubt why so many sacrifices were required. So with some context, we know that the Inca practiced cranial deformation, which is a form of body mutilation. And we may think of body mutilation as an archaic practice, like neck elongation and foot binding, as bizarre and ancient curiosities now dead in a civilized world. But body mutilation has always been around, and it's always been extreme. Note the practice of wearing corsets. This is a healthy rib cage. And then the skeleton from the 18th century. Healthy rib cage. And notice the bottom. Corset rib cage. The motivation for body deformation or mutilation can be obvious, or not so clear. So that's what this is. Merely one of the many forms of body mutilation, known as cranial deformation. Well, it sure doesn't seem like it. And that is because cranial deformation does not alter the volume or size of the skull. The capacity or the volume of a skull is unchanged by deformation. Deformed or not, skulls should have the same volume. The practice does not stretch or thin the bone, it simply reshapes it. So this person, with pronounced deformation, still has the same skull volume as anyone else in the population. The volume is just rearranged, not exemplified. Whether or not a skull is deformed, it should still be the same size. See the unaltered skull on the left, and the deformed skull on the right? They are still the same size. So the problem becomes, according to a full radiological exam conducted at Clínica Pardo in Cusco, Peru, this skull is 1,350 cubic centimeters, while the average skull of that age is consistently near 900 cubic centimeters. To put that in perspective, an adult human skull is about 1,450 cubic centimeters. The difference between 1,450 and 1,350 is negligible. So imagine your head on a 2-year-old. This skull is about 50% larger than it should be. Utterly massive. Just superficially speaking, the rib cage, though mummified, should not look that big in comparison to the skull. Note this healthy infant skeleton. See the difference in ratio? This is highly irregular. So it doesn't appear to be hydrocephalus, because the skull is in no way weakened or deteriorated. And it doesn't appear to be the result of deformation or mutilation, because it is so much larger than it should be. And deformation doesn't affect size. And this individual didn't even die from this condition, rather by a swift blow to the top of the neck, consistent with sacrificial killings. Peculiar, because according to Spanish friars, only the purest and most beautiful of children were sacrificed to the gods. And by all accounts, they were willing, pampered, and honored. Maybe someone thought this was beautiful. And make no mistake, had this individual's growth remained consistent, and it matured into an adult, and it was walking down the street today, it would cause car accidents. People would be unable to take their eyes off it. If you saw this as an adult in a parking lot, there is a good chance you would abandon your cart and retreat to the perceived safety of your vehicle. Large eye sockets, shallow nose, 50% larger skull volume, remarkable skull-to-body ratio. Even if this is a somehow yet unknown method and seemingly impossible method of cranial mutilation, which I guess it has to be, what were they doing? What was the goal? What were they emulating? Who were they mimicking? And honoring on Viracochan, the mountain of the Creator? I don't know. I'm not sure I want to know. Anyway, like and subscribe for more content, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.